I wanted to do a little segment on the Texas flood because I felt inspired. I was getting a little peed off because the media coverage on this is atrocious and I think incomplete at best in almost all cases. So, we're going to talk about how what's happening in Texas today fits into a long standing pattern of malicious intent and action by politicians. And yeah, we're going to try to follow along the threads, and it'll all come together in a terrifying but quite meaningful narrative, I guess. So we've all seen this. We've all seen the footage. It's been on screens across the world. Uh that's not that's not natural. I know we call this a natural disaster. This don't look natural. I don't even. Those are trees. Oh God, those are trees sticking out of the water. Okay. Um. We're just gonna. Okay. This is terrifying as well. You can just see like the line of people slowly retreating as the water keeps building. Okay. At a certain point, they're just like, yeah, let's get out of here. Okay. Great. Great. That's totally normal. Um. And people died. Obviously, billions of dollars of damage, I'm sure, is being done. Obviously, people talk about the lives lost, but even if you don't care about human lives and you just care about economy and stuff, this is not good. This is not what we want to see in a functioning society. So, what did the politicians have to say? I'm sure many of you have seen this, but let's just listen to this Texas official. We're just going to listen to what they're saying about the
Original
flood.
forecast that we received on Wednesday from the National Weather Service predicted 3 to 6 inches of rain in the Concho Valley and 4 to 8 inches of rain in the Hill Country. We worked with our own meteorologists to fine-tune that weather statement, and as many of you know, and many of you in broadcast journalism and meteorology, you can go back and look at your own forecast, and the amount of rain that fell in this specific location was never in any of those forecasts.
This rain event sat on top of that and dumped more rain than what was forecasted on both of those forks. When we got the report, it was about 7 feet or so on the South Fork, and within a matter of minutes it was up to 29 feet, and all of that converged at the Guadalupe, and that's where we saw those very quick rise in flood.
But listen, everybody got the forecast from the National Weather Service, right? You all got it. You're all in media. You got that forecast. It did not predict the amount of rain that we saw. The original forecast.
Okay, so what they're basically saying, we had no idea, we were completely unprepared for this flood, which is why people died, because they were completely unprepared. And they're blaming it specifically on, well, the national forecast was bad. So clearly those national forecasters, those national weather people, they're the problem here, right? Well, here's the former National Weather Service leaders warn about loss of life from NOAA cuts. So the five living former National Weather Service leaders, and by the way, this wasn't like the only time they tried to release a letter or make statements warning people, but they released an open letter to the American people warning about the impact of staffing and program cuts to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, saying their worst nightmare is the cuts will lead to needless loss of life. Okay, and this was released about 2 months ago on May 5th. 2025. Since the beginning of the year, more than 550 employees have left the National Weather Service, leaving it down 10% of its staffing levels ahead of hurricane season and the busiest time of year. And the proposed budget will cut the NOAA, the parent agency of the National Weather Service, by nearly 30%, virtually eliminating NOAA's research functions for weather, limiting ocean data observations, and decreasing funding for new satellites. They use the satellites to figure out the weather and stuff. So they say, our worst nightmare is that weather forecast offices will be so understaffed that there will be needless loss of life. We know that's a nightmare shared by those on the forecasting front lines and by the people who depend on their efforts. The Houston office has lost all three of its senior meteorologists, We have many offices across the country that are now having to close at night because they don't have sufficient staff. This was 2 months ago. We were warned. And what the Republican, this Texan dude is, trying to imply is that the National Weather Service isn't effective, and this is a tactic used often by kind of like conservative, or just to be more, explicit, fascist parties, fascist politicians, where they defund a public service and then they whine about how the public service isn't good enough, and then they use that as a justification to cut it more. That's like their idea. And if you don't believe me that that's their intention, we can look at Project 2025. Okay? This is an excerpt from Project 2025. I think this was like something written by the Heritage Foundation or something. Break up NOAA, the single biggest Department of Commerce agency outside of the decennial census years is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which houses the National Weather Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, and other components. NOAA garners $6.5 billion of the department's $12 billion annual operation budget and accounts for more than half of the department's personnel and non-blah blah blah. So, together, these form a colossal operation that has become one of the main drivers of the climate change alarm industry, and as such is harmful to future US prosperity. Very like Orwellian language. NOAA today boasts that is a provider of environmental information service, a provider of environmental stewardship services, and a leader in applied scientific research. Each of these functions could be provided commercially, likely at lower cost and higher quality. Okay? So, and what they're saying about, what they're claiming basically is that this National Weather Service providing all this accurate weather data, it's giving climate scientists too much information to warn and inform people about climate change. So they say data continuity is an important issue in climate science. Data collected by the department should be presented neutrally without adjustments intended to support any one side in the climate debate. So yeah, Project 2025, the Republicans are concerned that by funding the National Weather Service, you're providing too much solid evidence for climate change, basically. And so they say in explicit terms, it should be fully commercialized, which means fully privatized. It means completely destroy the National Weather Service, make it all private. And you might be thinking, why is fighting climate change, like fighting any action, resisting any action on climate change, so important to these Republicans? And why is privatization so important to them? Why can't they, like, whatever they're talking about, they can't help bring it up? Like, not only is this bad because it gives information to climate scientists, but apparently the National Weather Report also just needs to be fully commercialized. Okay. So we're gonna talk about, this is going back, but we're gonna talk about the roots of privatization. I'll zoom in too, so that we can read along. Privatization has historically been driven by power politics. What does that mean? Privatization was coined an English description of the German experience in the mid 1930s. In the early 20th century, many European economies featured state ownership of vital sectors like weather reporting. Reprivatizierung, or whatever that says, or reprivatization, marked by the Nazi regime's efforts to denationalize sectors of the German economy. As Bell notes, German privatization of the 1930s was intended to benefit the wealthiest sectors and enhance the economic position and political support of the elite. So privatization it was coined, it was invented by Nazis in the modern context. We have the word privatization because English journalists needed a word to describe what the Nazis were doing in the 1930s, which was privatization. And privatization, what it means by privatization has historically been driven by power politics, is that the explicit purpose, the intention behind privatization was to benefit the wealthiest sectors and enhance the economic position and political support of the elite. So basically consolidating the Nazi regime's power and their allies' power. Okay, that's why privatization started happening. Um, but you could say that the strategy goes back a decade to fascist Italy, okay? So then state monopolies on match production, life insurance, telephone networks, and tolled highways were ended after Mussolini came to power. So this was like following the fascist model in Italy, but the Nazis, they scaled it up to such an extent that the English, started reporting on. And that's how we got the term privatization. Now, you might be thinking, well, hold on, this is like almost 100 years in the past. Like, come on, this can't possibly, still be the thing. Well, let's look at I'm not going to play this interview because it contains many a naughty word, but this is the chief strategist and Republican national chair under both Reagan and George H.W. Bush, the first Bush. This is a very famous quote. Um, you start out by out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you. That backfires. He's talking about trying to run elections as a Republican. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes. And all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word. So this was in 1981. The main strategist of the Republicans is basically saying, like, I don't know if I'd call it a dog whistle, but it's certainly at least a Trojan horse of when we talk about cutting taxes, when we talk about cutting government, like privatizing government services, this is an indirect, abstract way to hurt black people. Like, we can't just run on let's hurt black people anymore. So we're going to run on privatization and cutting taxes because indirectly the people disproportionately affected by that are black and brown people, okay? This is like well established, the Southern strategy, still basically a thing. Um, so to get the support of, racists basically without alienating non-racists, this is the kind of stuff that they like to do, okay? And now when we specifically talk about climate change, we get into stuff like this. So, projected impact of climate change on agricultural yields. You can more or less see that the areas with the most red are areas, full of black and brown people. That's just agriculture. This here is an overall map of the overall direct risks of physical climate impacts. And you can see it's almost a one-to-one mapping of white countries versus non-white countries. Like all the white countries or whiter countries are yellow, have less of a risk. And the highest risk places are all, black and brown places. Like it's very spooky how precise this is. Also, the countries that are more yellow are generally the countries that, even though they represent us, have always represented a small minority of the global population, have consumed the vast majority of fossil fuels, in the past century. So you can see how the legacy of the global north using, over 90% of the fossil fuels over the last century has affected and is affecting and will affect the global south. And just to clarify what happened, there's a group of about 10 countries that are responsible for about half of the historic emissions. And still to this day, there's a group of about 50 companies that are responsible for the vast majority of emissions. So just like power is extremely concentrated and wealth is extremely concentrated, those same powerful, wealthy entities are generally the ones uh, producing the most emissions as well. And as we can see, having these kinds of disproportionate effects on other people. So what I'm getting at is if you put these maps together with this, it becomes pretty clear that being anti-climate change, it's not a mistake. It's not like a misunderstanding of the science. It is part of a low-key strategy of racism, of hurting certain people and not other people, right? Of course, like when you cut a public service or when you do climate change, it's going to hurt white people too, but disproportionately, these are the impacts. And you might think, okay, but look at US here. It's kind of still yellow. It's doing all right. Well, there's been many studies that show that climate change has a disproportionately racist impact, even on those living in the States. So, a new study, this is just one metric, but a new study that black people living in most US cities are subject to double the level of heat stress as their white counterparts. Okay, so the researchers say the differences were not explained by poverty, so they didn't track exactly with poverty, but by historic racism and segregation. As a result, people of color more generally live in areas with fewer green spaces and more buildings and roads. You might be wondering what the hell's the relevance of fewer green spaces? Well, green spaces and bodies of water in general absorb a lot more heat. So if there's a heat wave, and you have a green space or a large body of water, that's gonna take away from the amount of heat that can heat up the adjacent land. So just by having those nearby, you're kind of like giving yourself a little buffer, giving yourself a little safety space, from just being completely overheated. So they track it back to a previous study found a correlation between warmer neighborhoods in big cities with racist housing policies dating back to the 1930s. So again, it's a segregation thing, it's a redlining thing, it's a New Deal not giving the means to black people of getting their own houses. So this is very an entrenched problem, okay? And there's more. There's so many studies like this, but you can look at it. Racial disparities and climate change related health effects in the United States. Climate change is causing warming over most parts of the USA and more extreme weather events. The health impacts of these changes are not experienced equally. We synthesize the recent evidence that you could like read the study if you want, but global warming is having a disparate impact on the health impacts of people of color, including children. So it talks about people of color. So all these different, I'll zoom in a bit, sorry. All these different kinds of people are at higher risk of climate related health impacts than whites, although it's not always the case. There's always going to be outliers. Um, Studies of adults have found evidence of racial disparities related to climatic changes with respect to mortality, respiratory and cardiovascular disease, mental health, and and heat related illnesses. Children are particularly vulnerable to health impacts of climate change, and infants and children of color have experienced adverse perinatal outcomes, occupational heat stress, and increases in emergency department visits associated with extreme weather. And I just want to pair that, going back to our little map here, which parts of the world have the highest birth rates right now? Which parts of the world have the most children? Africa and the Middle East. This is not just like, racial genocide. This is like infanticide. It's like, and it's not an accident. So, given all this background, given, the many decades of, racist policies and, clear racial malice, you know, going out of your way to do these things just to like cater to racists and to hurt communities of color and to consolidate your own power as a rich, mostly white elite, all of that. um what are politicians going to do about this, right? There's so many things that could be done. So what does our politicians say it? Well, here's Mike Johnson, the leader of the Republicans in the House leader, in fact. Let's hear what he has to
State and
say.
federal resources have just poured into that area. Is there anything more that can be done congressionally, legislatively to help these folks?
In a moment like this, we feel just as helpless as everyone else does. I've talked to my colleagues there in Texas, Chip Roy and August Pfluger, whose families, that's Chip's district. August's daughters were at the camp. We also had Betty Carter of Georgia, had grandchildren there. It touches so many families, and all we know to do at this moment is pray. Every available resource has been deployed.
All we know to do at this moment is pray. He feels helpless. He doesn't know what to do except to pray. If he was being honest, I would say resign. I would say you're supposed to be a political leader. You're not helpless. You're the leader of the US House. What are you talking? What? That's what I would say if I thought he was lying. Or if I thought he was being honest, but I think he, like, again, this is part of the Republican strategy. It's not so much like, oh, we're not going to do anything because we feel helpless. It's like, no, this advances their power, hurting black communities, hurting communities of color, causing climate change. All of this consolidates the power of the US regime, both nationally, like, and internationally. So this is, a pure power grab, right? And I don't want to make this like, I can do this just quick. Hakeem Jeffries' statement on floods. I'm not going to make this like a partisan thing, because here, this is what, and this, again, looking over all the issues we just talked about, this is what the leader of the Democratic House is saying. My prayers are with everyone in the path of horrific flood. I'm so glad you're praying, bro. Particularly with the parents and families of the girls at Camp Mystic. Okay. I joined the nation in mourning for those who have been lost. House Democrats stand ready to support the response effort in any way possible. We are grateful to the first responders who are putting themselves in danger while working to save lives under extremely difficult conditions. You might say, like, what more could he do? He says, may God watch over the people of Texas and our country. Okay, very religious posting. You might say, like, well, he's the minority house leader. What can he do? Well, he can at least talk about any of this. He can say, hey, Project 2025 said they were going to defund it. The dudes in charge of that weather service have been warning us. You could say this is part, if you really wanted to be real, you could say this is like an extension of the Southern strategy and we need to be more serious on climate change. He says nothing. He's got nothing. They don't do anything. And it fits a larger pattern. So at the root of this, if we're trying to solve climate change, even the Democrats, while they acknowledge climate change, they will not support any solution for climate change that inconveniences the wealthy and like threatens, the profits of wealthy, interests. And one of the main ways this has manifested itself, especially, throughout the entire course of the 20th century, and we'll get to that, is a bias towards investing in fossil fuels and other non-renewable sources. So the reason that fossil fuels today are relatively economic, like in some cases it's relatively cheap to power things by oil or coal or whatever, the reason for that is because over 90% of our investments in developing efficient energy sources has been in those sources. So we've spent like 100 years almost exclusively investing in making, coal and oil extraction more efficient. And so that at least makes it almost competitive. These days, it's not even like the cheapest fuel source, but it's like, it's only competitive because there's a history of investing so much in it and not in other things. So now you get like, market-driven solutions that don't do nearly enough, like carbon tax credits, which actually, if you're a billionaire like Elon Musk, you can abuse the systems to get super wealthy. So again, the only mild climate change action they support is action that allows the wealthy to consolidate their power further and to get even richer. Okay, great. And that's like the best case of Democratic politicians. We're not even talking about Republicans. You put them aside because they're not even pretending it's a real thing, climate change. So you'll see a lot of like hubbub, a lot of banks and a lot of centrist politicians, whatever, will say that we need to get into nuclear. That's the key. Well, let's talk about nuclear. And like its ability to help us transition away from fossil fuels, okay? So the Nuclear Energy Agency has accurately estimated the planet's economically accessible uranium resources would last 200 years at current rates of consumption. So at current rates of consumption, we got 200 years of fuel left. No problem, right? Well, if we're trying to do a transition to clean energy, nuclear energy provides about 9% of the world's electricity, whereas fossil fuels, as this article states, about 80% of the world's energy. So, if we're trying to deal with climate change and transition away from fossil fuels and become carbon neutral and all that, are we, we would basically, if you're looking at nuclear as a fuel, you would have to like, take 80% more of the energy production with nuclear power, which would mean basically having 10 times the amount of nuclear energy. If we do that, then all of a sudden this 200 years becomes 20 years. Okay? And I know that like not 100% of fossil fuels is going to, is intended to be replaced by nuclear energy. But the point is, this creates scarcity. This creates control and power for those who have like access to those limited resources of nuclear fuel. And if you don't realize how important a consideration this is, you can look back at the history of free energy, and this web page is okay. It's doing all right. It's kind of formatting itself. But this was a dude, Nikola Tesla. Over 100 years ago, he was trying to research free wireless power for the whole planet. Like, just to use a very rough analogy, if you've ever used like those magnetic charging things, you put the thing down on the magnetic pad and it charges automatically. His idea was like, what if we turned the whole ground into one of those magnetic chargy things, or, it'd be an electrical thing, but what if we changed the whole ground into something like that, and then all our devices would be powered by it wirelessly? Okay? So he was making some progress. He made a 142-foot tall coil that was able to power light bulbs wirelessly over 2 miles away. Wow. But the issue was the whole project was financed by a very evil man named JP Morgan. And what JP Morgan came in and did was, he was scrutinizing the project, and at one point, very famously, he killed the project with the famous statement, "Where can I put the meter?" Because you see, while Nikola Tesla was concerned with trying to provide the whole world clean, permanent, renewable, wireless, free energy, JP Morgan's only concern was, how can I profit off this? And the whole project got killed because he realized, the financiers, the capitalists from Wall Street, they realized that they can't put the meter anywhere when it comes to this. And if you take this in a modern context, or not even a modern, but just over the last century, you start to understand why all the investment has been in fossil fuels and none of it has been in renewables. If you invest in solar, if you invest in wind, and you make those cheaper, then it permanently undercuts the profitability of fossil fuels. It permanently decreases the competitiveness of fossil fuels, of nuclear, of everything like that. And furthermore, you can't like centrally control something like solar power nearly as easily, right? Anyone can have a solar panel array and a battery, like so, on a random little island somewhere, they could do that and they could power themselves, right? But with fossil fuels, it takes giant extractive industries that are limited to a few places on Earth. With nuclear, same thing, and these giant facilities to make the nuclear power. And that's a method of control. Not only is it a method of profitability, but it's a method of control. So, we need to think about all these issues in terms of power politics. That's what I'm trying to get at here. And the reason that you'll see a big push now for nuclear over solar and wind. It's the same thing. They want scarcity. They want control to basically come down to a couple companies slash governments that, control the whole world's supply of uranium. Um, and they want to continue being able to profit. They don't want solar to become so cheap that people can just like get their own power. You know what I mean? They don't want like rooftop solar to become a thing. They don't want decentralized power grids that way. And it's not because it's economically efficient, right? It's not because they don't believe in climate change. They know it's a thing. They like climate change because it helps. Like, the more poor people suffer from climate change, the more their power is consolidated, right? It's because the reason they want to maintain these non-renewable energy sources is purely to maintain their power, maintain their methods of oppression, maintain their ability to just shut the electricity off if they need to, if they want to. This is fully an attempt to keep us oppressed. So anyway, I won't go on too much about that, but I hope we can see here. I hope when we hear about privatization, cutting taxes, cutting public services, I hope we can contextualize that in a century of fascism, because that's what it is.